Bridget McKenna is a sister of St. Clair, and by all accounts, a very unusual woman. It's very few sisters have written a best-selling book, but she's done that. It's called Miracles Do Happen, and it describes much of her work, which involves healing and praying with people who are broken and in need of her ministry. Bridget McKenna travels extensively throughout the world, but we're glad to have her with us here today. Bridget, you're very welcome. And I'd like to begin by asking you, how did you begin praying yourself?
Well, I think when I entered the convent, we had great talks on prayer and long lectures on it. And I was great at getting in prayers. It was like an obligation. But I think the real experience of prayer came, or a hunger. There's a passage in Scripture that talks about the soul thirsting. I went through a terrible crisis of dryness and darkness, but I used to say there must be more to the spiritual life than I'm experiencing, because I would go in and I'd be looking at my watch and say, well, I've 15 more minutes, and I would say the prayers I had to say. But in 1970, just at the time that I was going through a very bad period with my arthritis, I started questioning and saying, could this be what religious life is about and what the spiritual life is about? And I think my first encounter seeing people who really experienced prayer and lived in a living relationship with Jesus was Mexican migrant workers. I was very scared of prayer meetings or anything to do with them. And I saw a group of Mexican migrant workers praying together. And I remember listening to them, talking to the Lord, and hearing them just relate things that happened in their prayer time and what the Lord was doing in their lives. And they were very poor. And I think that made me examine, how do I pray? What is my prayer life like? And I went away and I made a retreat. And it was during this retreat that the first thing I learned about prayer is that prayer isn't so much what I do, but what the Lord wants to do. And that first time I went to a monastery, you may have heard of Mother Angelica in Poor Clare Monastery in America, and I spent 7 days there. And it wasn't until the third day that I got a great sense for myself now, and not everybody prays the same way and there are different ways, but that the Lord calling me to pray before the Blessed Sacrament. And I read about St. Teresa, and she talked about the prayer of looking, that it's very hard in a world of distractions to just focus right away on the Lord. And she said, if you can have some point to look at, and if you can just focus on whether it's an image like an icon or a scene of Jesus. Well, I found the Blessed Sacrament. I used to look at the host, and I would use my imagination and just say, well, this is Jesus. I mean, he is alive. And I would talk to him, and then I would listen. I tell people now, when they say, well, God never speaks to me, and I say to them, but do you listen? And that was in 1970, I think, when I started to experience myself more than performing or coming out and saying, well, what did I get out of prayer? And thinking I had to have results. Just discipline myself to give time.
Is it true that you pray for 3 hours every day?
I try. Most days I get 2 hours. Every day before I start working, I work with Father Kevin Scallon on retreats, and we usually spend 2 hours every morning in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. Any time, if we have to start at 4:30, it means we have to get up early. But I do spend those 2 hours, and then if there's another hour during the day. When I'm not working, I try to spend 2 to 3, 4 hours.
Is prayer very easy for you, or
No.
is it something you have to struggle with?
No, it's not easy at all. I think there are seasons. I think there are times, and all people have seasons in their lives. And one of the seasons that I see is that there's a season like the fresh water and the green pasture, and when it's very easy and you can feel, the Lord's presence. There are times when I find it easy to go. But there are other times when I'm in the valley of darkness, when it's like there's nothing there and you're just making yourself, just spend the time with the Lord. And then there are other times when I take the scriptures and I'll just read a passage over and over, or the Psalms. I find the Psalms, for praising, great help to me personally. But if I were asked, people say, oh, Sister Bridget, it's so easy for you to pray. I said, no, the most important thing, I think, for all people is not reading books about prayer and listening to tapes about prayer, but it is to pray. And they say, well, how do you do that? I say, well, the first thing is to find time. If you give the Lord time, it's like sitting, I use the example often about sitting in the sun. The sun can be shining outside, and if you never go into it, it's not going to affect you. But if you do go into it, then you don't have to do anything, but just be present, and the sun will do the rest. And I find that in my own life in prayer, that when I give time, like before I speak, or get up to give a talk, do I get all that I'm going to say? I don't get a thing sometimes. I just sit there and I praise God, and I say, come on, Jesus, I'm going to be talking about 15 minutes. I get nothing. But when I get up to speak, I feel the power of the Lord with me. Or when I have to go out, and meet somebody who maybe is in a terrible accident or who's dying of AIDS, or that, I just get an inner strength. And I often sense that it's like radium treatment for the body. That the power of the Lord in our lives, that it's what it does to the soul, to the inner life, and it gives you that inner strength. Also, I think for me, if I didn't pray, I don't think I could speak with conviction. I think that the Lord teaches you the values, and it also protects you from blindness, because you can become very blind in today's society. And I think that that's where my great faith is, that people who pray are able to discern between truth and falsehood, between light and darkness. And if you don't pray, it's very easy to rationalize away, sin and all its effects.
You mentioned there the idea of the dark night of the soul, which I suppose is something that many people go through when they're learning to pray, and then things begin to go wrong and they're tempted to give up prayer altogether. What advice would you have for people who are going through this arid time spiritually in their lives?
I would say persevere. I think that the dark night of the soul, or dryness, is the Lord bringing us into an adult relationship with Him, where we're not just depending on our emotions and our feelings. And there's excuse me, there's a lovely story about the American Indians, which I often use to compare it to this testing period, where the young boy for the initiation ceremony is taken out into the woods, and he's put sitting all night, and he has to sit there and not move a muscle for the whole night. And his test of being initiated as an adult is that he will not move no matter what he hears. And the story is told, how the whole night long he begins to hear the animals of the forest, and he doesn't move, but he's petrified. But he sits there, doesn't move a muscle. And when the first rays of dawn comes, he sees sitting right in front of him his father, who was there all night long, but he couldn't see him. And I think that it is the same with the whole experience of prayer and the dark night, that we say God isn't. People say, oh, I used to be able to pray long ago, but now I don't get anything. And actually what the Lord is trying to do is to bring us into an adult relationship where our prayer isn't like a seesaw. If I feel like praying today, I pray. But that we actually persevere in faithfulness. And that if we live through and are willing to persevere in that dark night, that we will come out at the banquet table where we will not be affected by the events of life. Or, there are people who just through daily events, their whole prayer life is like, it's up and down, up and down. And I think that's where I prayed myself. I went through a pretty dark night of there are different stages of dark night. I don't ask for it because it's pretty terrible. But one of the times that I went through was for 3 months. And nothing meant anything to me. And I used to go to Mass. Mass would be over. And I'd be saying, oh my God, I'm just even getting into it. Same with prayer, it didn't mean a thing. But I made myself. I said, I know that I don't seem to be getting any, but I know that the Lord would ask me to be faithful, just like a marriage. It's beautiful at the beginning, but I mean, then you come to the part where you've made a commitment and you have to really live out. And I think it's the same, not just for, people often say, oh well, priests and sisters, and it's all right for you as religious. But I tell people, praying is like the very first thing that you did or I did. The very first thing that a human being does is breathe. That's the first thing when they come from the mother's womb. And the first thing they do is breathe. The moment they stop breathing, they die. And I think it's the same with prayer, that, prayer is the breath of the soul. And when people stop, the spiritual life dies. And that's why the dark night is sometimes, only to bring us into a deeper relationship with the Lord, which I have to say, though, Father Jim, it doesn't make it easy, but there is a great, great grace comes when you persevere.
Something that I've been fascinated by is the number of priests who have spoken to me and said that young people have come to them and said, Father, will you teach me how to pray? And they're not quite sure how to go about it. What kind of advice would you give there?
Well, the first thing that I give to not just to young people, to all people, and I do it myself, is, what is prayer? I know there are different levels of prayer, and people talk about, you can read a lot, but the first thing I ask them is, do you believe in Jesus? I talk about as a living person. You see, I think it's very important to recognize that Jesus is alive, that you're not talking to the clouds or to the wall or to a little box up there, that the resurrected Jesus, he's real. And therefore, if he's real, then I relate to him as a living person. People pray saying nice things. And this is what I say to young people, they get mad over things that happen, or they're frustrated, or they're angry, and, they say, well, I can't say that to God because, that's not how you pray. And I said, prayer is having a real relationship with a living person. You don't say nice things to people to make them feel. You don't need to make God feel good. Just tell him exactly how you feel. And I have often related the story of a young blind girl. She was about 15 years of age, and I was asked to speak in a home in Florida for the blind. And it was the blind and the deaf. I watched them going to Mass. The blind children were led up by the deaf children. At the breakfast that morning, there was a little girl called Karen sitting opposite me, and she had no eyes. She was the result of her parents took drugs, and she had a very severe facial deformity. But in the midst of the breakfast, she was eating fried eggs and trying to get them with her hands, and she put her little hand out and she felt my hand and she said, Sister Breed, she said, you feel sorry for me, don't you? I said, yes, because from this part there was nothing, just two slits. And I said, yes, I do. Well, she said, you don't have to. And she said, I mightn't have eyes here, but she said, I'm not blind. And she then related a beautiful testimony about how a priest came to give her a treat in the school for the children. And she said she was very angry. She resented very much when she found out that her parents abandoned her because of her deformity. She grew up with, in this convent, in this it was orphanage. And she said as she grew, she got more angry when she found out what had happened. But so this priest came one day, and she said, I'll always remember that when the sister introduced me, he took me, she said, he just put his arm around me and he said, Karen, just tell me about it. And she said, no, because she said, you'd only get mad at me because I'm mad. But he got her to relate, and he said, now I want you to do something for me. He said, I want you to sit every morning for 10 minutes and just tell God exactly how mad you feel. And just tell him all that anger and resentment. And he said, remember that he's listening. And he introduced her, of course what he was doing was introducing her to prayer. But what actually happened, she told me herself, she said, Sister, I thought, well, I've nothing to lose. So before the sister would come in every morning, she would sit on the side of her bed, and she said, the only way I could see, she said, with the inner eyes was, I pictured somebody who, yes, he loved me. But she said, I didn't know what love was. But she said, I cried and I told him how I hated people for what they did to me, and that that it was all right for these nuns and priests who were talking, but they didn't know what I was suffering. But she said, I did that for 2 to 3 weeks. And she said, then I just sat there one morning. I said, well, I've told you everything now. But she said, the most beautiful thing happened to me. And she said, you mightn't believe me. But she said, it was as if I just had this inner sense of being loved. But I couldn't describe it. And she put her little hand out, and it was a great question. She said, Sister Breach, I know Jesus now. I have never seen him. She said, I suppose she said you'd say, well, how would you know what he looks like? But she said, I know him because every day I talk to him and I meet him. And she said, this afternoon I'm flying to Miami to speak at a youth convention. And she said, I'm going to speak to young people about the value and the power of prayer. And she said, what I'm going to tell them is that prayer doesn't change God, but it changes us. And she said, the first thing I learned is that Jesus is real and that you don't have to be nice to him, you just have to treat him as somebody who's alive. And that's what I tell young people, and that girl's life, she was probably one of the happiest young people I met, and yet she had no eyes. She had a very big deformity. She would say, that people felt sorry for her. She said, don't feel sorry for me. She said, I'm very happy. And it's the same, with so many people, who discover that Jesus is alive. And that's one of my talks, I tell people is that the easiest way to become a witness to Christ is not to be witnessing to 2,000 years ago. I mean, the gospel, if Jesus is alive, he must be saying things, doing things, and acting today as he did 2,000 years ago, because it's a contradiction for people to say, well, nothing happens today. And, in my work with priests, I tell the priests this, as well as myself. So, Father, if today you were given a pen and a piece of paper, and you were asked to write your gospel according to Jim, or the gospel according to Breach, what would I say? I couldn't quote anything from 2,000 years ago. How would I introduce Jesus to people? What is he doing in my life? What is he saying? It's a challenge.
Well, surely if there were to be a gospel according to Breach, it would involve a great deal about praying for healing. Would you talk to me a little bit about that ministry which you have?
Yes, I would say, Father Jim, that more and more now as I look back, I'm 18 years now in the ministry of healing, and as you know, I was healed myself, which is a big help of a crippling disease. I would say today, my attitude, maybe my approach to healing has very much changed from what it was in the beginning. Changed in this way, that there are two things that I believe. One, that yes, that healing does happen, just as I said in my book, miracles do happen, that Jesus very much wants people to expect his power to be manifested. The second thing is that as a Catholic, I have a great belief that there's a great need for Catholics to be converted to the sacraments. And what I mean by that is to discover the power of Christ to heal in every sacrament, in the different vocations in life. And the reason why I'm saying this to you is because most of my healing ministry is now encased in the approach of, as a Catholic sister, to the sacraments, because I think for me it also protects me from becoming the false god or the healer. Sister Breach, McKenna comes, everything will change. I'll give you a few examples. A lot of people come to me, say with cancer, leukemia, diseases that are incurable, and they'll say to me, Sister Breach, I've tried everything. I say, well, have you really approached the priest? Have you asked for the sacrament of the sick? And they say, oh no, but I'm not, I'm not sick enough to get that. I'm not dying. And I say to them, but that sacrament is a sacrament of healing. It guarantees that Jesus is there, and in what capacity? To heal. Now, will he heal you physically? I don't know. But there's a level of healing that will take place that maybe it's not today or tomorrow, you'll see. And I tell about when Father Kevin Scallon and myself were in Papua New Guinea just short time ago, a young sister who had food poisoning, hadn't eaten for months, was really dying, came to see the doctor, and he wasn't there. And she came to a convent where Father Kevin was just beginning. It was in the middle of the celebration of the Eucharist, and he was administering the sacrament of the sick to a lot of old sisters. This young Polish girl came in, and she looked and she thought, well, I'm not old, but I'm very sick. And she had heard us, challenging them and saying, that it's not built on feelings, really believe that Jesus is here, that this is, as Catholics, we believe that the sacraments are guarantees that Jesus is present. And she said when Father Kevin put his hand on her first, and then he anointed her, she felt this sensation like coming from the pit of her stomach, and it just went through her body. And she said, I said something that I never even dreamt of praying for healing. She said, why? I don't know, but she said, I just felt I'm healed. So after Mass was the test, because they had a banquet for us, and she came in and she took 2 huge piles on her plate, dinner, and eat her meal. She said she felt great. And the following day she came to the priest retreat to give witness, and she said that, she knew that at the moment of the sacrament that she was healed. And this has happened so many times. And same with, and I speak a lot so on the sacrament of the sick, but also in the Eucharist. I just had a beautiful experience a couple of weeks ago with Father. How they in Lourdes, they bring the Blessed Sacrament around. Well, one of the things that I talked to them about, I said, look, I can pray for healing, but I leave. But you have the Eucharist, and you have, the privilege to come into any Catholic church, and there the Eucharistic Lord is. But at the healing service, Father would walk through the church holding the monstrance, and I would say to the people, look up at Jesus. Just look at him and ask him for whatever you want. And there was a couple who came, and they were pretty desperate, not for themselves, and this is again healing through the power of intercession, really asking for other people. This couple came to the parish. Their sister, the woman's sister, was an alcoholic, and she was also a non-believer. She believed in nothing. She said religion was only for the weak, and she couldn't accept it at all. But at the moment when they were looking at the host, and I kept saying, look, at the centurion said, Jesus, I believe, you don't have to come. I said, maybe you have somebody, someplace in the world that needs healing, whether it's spiritual or physical or whatever. So the woman said, I really beg the Lord on my faith to reach out to my sister, because she was just dying. She said she had destroyed herself with alcohol and loneliness. The following morning at 8:30, the phone rang from Texas to Florida, where she lived, and she came to see one of our sisters at the convent. And she said, oh my God, she said, what happened? My sister phoned me this morning, and she said, something has happened to me. She said, at 8:30 last night, I was in my room, and she said, this power came over me, and she said, you may think I'm losing my mind or that I'm drunk. But she said, I saw the face of God. She said, I saw the face of Jesus, and he said to me, everything is forgiven, you're healed. She said, I just want you to know that I'm going to AA, that I've declared, because she would not say she was an alcoholic. That woman was completely spiritually transformed. And to me, the greatest healing is the spiritual. Same with the sacrament of reconciliation. I'm a great believer today that an awful lot of sickness that is happening begins in the spiritual, and that people are desperate to unload their guilt. Like if you wouldn't be doing this, Father Jim, but if you, in America they talk about going to a beauty parlour. If you ever go to a barber shop, or if you ever sit in a train or a bus or a plane, you discover people coming to you who may not be physically sick in one way, but who are very disturbed and very burdened, great tragedies in their lives. And many of them, when they talk to me, I recognise that they have serious moral problems. And I tell them the story of the woman at the well, that when she met Jesus, she was very preoccupied with her jug. But Jesus zeroed in very gently on what was the real problem. And when he said to her in a very subtle way, bring your husband. But he led her to a point where her eyes were opened, and she recognized things that were wrong in her life. And I say to them, you know, you're telling me all this, but why don't you go and talk to a priest? The difference is that the hairdresser, the barman, I mean, you can tell them, but I mean, they can't give you this great grace, which is the absolution. And I bring out, I say, you know, the first thing Jesus did after the resurrection was he breathed on the disciples, and he gave the church this power. And to me, to see, you know, when people come, and this happens a lot with AIDS patients. I do a lot of ministry. I get a lot of phone calls from AIDS patients who are dying, who are desperate, who are ashamed to come out of the woodwork. And they'll call me on my phone late at night. I have a phone that I have prayer on it, but I pick it up often. And I'll say, look, I'll pray for you, you know, now in your last stages of AIDS, but will you do something for me? Especially if they're Catholic, you know, and even if not, I say, would you go and talk out? Because it's much more important for you to get your inner life healed. Do you know, Father Jim, they call me back, and it's absolutely beautiful. The healing and the anger and the rejection and the bitterness that leaves. And I say to them, you know, when you meet Jesus, because he doesn't judge you, he's a God of mercy, he loves you, and you know what he said? Come to me. I forgive you for the past. That's why he died, to forgive us, to take away our sin. And that's, you know, when you ask me about healing, most of my work today and most of the healings that I see, and I see lots of them. You know, if I had to write, I say, in the Bible, the scriptures according to which, I could write volumes about, and they're not all physical healing, and not everybody is healed. You know, I'm asked the question, what about the people who are not healed? What are the people who don't accept? And I say, well, one prayer I pray is that their attitude, because sickness, especially when you talk about physical sickness without faith is misery. I mean, when you go to some of the parts of the world, I remember in Taiwan, seeing the people there, the old people, miserable. It was misery. And to go then to where the Daughters of Charity were running a home for the dying, and to see them receiving the Lord, they were transparent. And so what I say to them is that, you know, like the little blind girl said, prayer doesn't change God, but it changes us, and it changes the attitude. And not everybody will get the physical healing, but they will get an inner strength. And I'd say that I'm a great believer, you know, in the Gospel of John 6, in verse 57, Jesus said, I draw my life from the Father, and those who eat my flesh and drink my blood draw life from me. And I think there's a quality of life that surpasses sickness or anything, that every Christian, whether you're a leper, no matter what physical or emotional, whatever sickness, that there's a quality of life that Jesus offers to people. But that quality of life goes back to the whole life of prayer, of faith, and that quality of life isn't built on the happenings and events that, you know, people's lives are up and down, and they're into despair. But when you have that quality of life, you're able to face the cross with strength.
Finally, Sister Breach, could I ask you to lead us in prayer?
Lord Jesus, I thank you and praise you for my brothers and sisters this day. And I just pray that your healing power will flow, Lord, out to every person who is just looking at this moment. Heal them spiritually, Lord. Give them that quality of life that you offer as the bread of life. Ask you to heal physically the sicknesses and give inner strength and peace to all your people. Ask you, Mary, just to draw all of these people to the heart of your Son, Jesus, where they will find strength and healing. And I ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. God bless you.